Welcome to the 1000 Hours Outside podcast. I just finished a new book called Disconnected by Thomas Kersting, and I loved it. And so we are here today to talk about his book and lots of other things. This is how to protect your kids from the harmful effects of device dependency. Tom, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so okay, we were just talking a little bit about Tom's bio because I think it's super interesting. He's a psychotherapist. He used to be a school counselor and a regular guest expert for Fox News. And then he said this was a while ago, but also co-host of two former A&E network television series, Surviving Marriage and Monster-in-Laws. Those actually sound really interesting and pertinent. Tom appears regularly on popular talk shows and news shows, providing insight and advice about parenting, family, education, and wellness. I love that broad bio. You've done cool things.
Yeah, it's all, it kind of comes down to the same thing. It's just, I'm here, I guess, on this planet to try to help as many people as I can to just, be the best they can be, live the best life they could be the best parents. And, I see that we all have this ability. We just need to, develop the confidence and know how to just go out there in the world and do what we can do to the best of our ability.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Yeah, I loved your bio. It's super just diverse, but like you said, also not, So I loved how this book started out. You started out with the 80s childhood, basically. You say, I was helmetless. I think a lot of people will really relate to this. I was a helmetless big wheel riding child of the 1980s. I walked a half mile in the dark to the bus stop each morning, faced the occasional bully, threw eggs at other kids on Halloween, and rode my Huffy all around town. You talked about being outside all day long in the summer with the kids in the neighborhood. Nothing was planned out for us. The only thing we cared about was adventure. We had Ataris and Nintendos, but spent much less time playing with them than we did playing with each other. When it was time for dinner, we were home on time and ate with our families every night. We had few worries and we were just kids. We all survived. So I think a lot of people, I love that opening of the book. I think a lot of people will relate with that and remember those days. What has changed in 40 years?
Screens. And that's really what the whole book is about. I mean, I think I'm 49. I can't believe I'm even saying that. And I just think back when I reflect back to being a kid. I mean, we didn't have any money. My parents didn't have, they had 4 kids by the time they were 25. Nobody cared about any of that. And all of my friends that I grew up with, my next door neighbors, were still best friends to this day. And
Wow.
we were just outside all the time. And the old adage, it was basically my mom would shout out the front door before 6 p.m. Tommy, Joey, Carrie, Peggy. That was all of us. Time for dinner. And we had better be home, for dinner. And we were just like, out here playing manhunt, playing wiffle ball, riding our bikes. And, we'd have to go home and have dinner together. But, the moral of the story is we had, unadulterated fun. We weren't immersed in some, hypnotic trance from a little device. And it really just, it just solidified us as social, emotional beings and so forth.
Yeah. One of my favorite lines from that paragraph is you said nothing was planned out for us. And I see that also as a big difference in childhood today is that everything is planned out, from dawn till dusk. Kids have a really long school day. They have homework, often several hours, and then all these extracurriculars that are good things and are helpful and in different realms, but there's not that time for adventure, like you said.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was just actually currently working on my next book, which it comes out in February of 2023. I was just doing some writing this morning, and I just actually touched on. I'm going to read a little bit right now.
Yeah.
For the people who probably be interested in this, it's really about the importance of developing social emotional skills through childhood play, and the author that I'm referencing touches on helicopter parenting. And that's just not really just the parents that are constantly hovering. I mean, that's part of it. Also, how parents orchestrate, how they think their children should play, and how that it really can affect, the kid's own instinctive capabilities. And what the author says is that when children become highly sensitized to what their parents want to see while playing, they often suppress the most intrinsic play experience in order to gain approval from the parent who is trying to mold them. This can cause them to become skilled at pleasing adults and developing conformist behavior, which reduces their intrinsic motivations and authentic exuberance that is found on the playground.
Wow, that's powerful. And that is,
Mm.
I mean, you touch on that in that one sentence. Nothing was planned out for us. And I love that phrase, authentic exuberance. That's fantastic. It's almost like this is easier, right? It's like, to have nothing planned out for your kids, that's easier, than having to, schedule, drive, and pay. It's expensive, all these activities. So it's funny that we have chosen this more difficult route. Um,
Yeah,
and now that maybe it's not the best for our kids anyway.
yeah, I know. And kids, if you look at different, polls that have come out in recent years, different surveys, the majority of kids would prefer to be inside, playing like video games and stuff than they prefer to be outside, which is not really our natural habitat as human
Yeah.
beings.
You touch on that in the book, right? I mean, you talk about, I think I
Yeah.
have some of that written down here. I remember reading about that because inside is where the screens are, and that it didn't used to be that way. It used to be, get me outside. I'm bored in this house, and so I want to go see certain things, or, so that's a big change. But partially maybe goes back to the fact that there was kids to play with. Um, in the neighborhood, and so there's more motivation to get outdoors.
Yeah, just unstructured.
Yeah, unstructured. Okay, so there's a phrase in your book that I actually not heard before: acquired attention deficit disorder. You say the more we become used to just sound bites and tweets, the less patient we become with more complex, more meaningful information. And I do think you might lose the ability to analyze things with any depth and nuance. Like any skill, if you don't have it, you lose it. So, can you tell us what is acquired attention deficit disorder? Sort of what are the implications here? How can we avoid it?
Yeah. So it's actually how I got into this topic of screen time. I'm a pioneer in this territory. I started lecturing on the topic of the dangers of too much screen time starting in 2009. All right, way
Oh,
before.
yeah.
And it was because at the time I was working at a public high school. I was a counselor, and I ran a committee called the Intervention and Referral Services Committee, and we handled something known as 504 accommodations. So anybody listening right now, so if you've never, you may have heard of a 504 plan that they give to kids in school. Some kids that have, if a kid has a disability. Well, what it is, it comes from Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is an anti-discrimination law that states if a kid has any kind of a disability that's affecting them academically, they may be eligible for specific accommodation. So in September of 2008, how many years ago is that? 13 years ago, we had our first parent meeting of the year. Parents would come in and request accommodations. And prior to that, it was always, for physical disabilities or, Crohn's disease, diabetes. And yeah, so that's when I was working as a school counselor. We had a parent come in whose teenage son had recently been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. And that was literally the first time I ever seen that in, 15 years working as a counselor, a teenager,
Wow.
being diagnosed late. And what many people don't understand is that attention deficit disorder is not something that you get later on in life, but that you catch. It's a neurological condition that you're born with. So a child that is the average age of diagnosis is 8 years old. And if you have a child that has ADHD, you can't not notice it by age 5. So long story short, after that meeting, for the rest of that school year, literally every single request was for a teenager that had been diagnosed with ADHD. So that's what got my wheels spinning, and I started researching like what's going on here. And I came across all of this research on screen time and what it does to the brain neurologically. And one of the researchers had coined a term that referred to as acquired ADHD, meaning that they estimated that roughly 70% of kids teenagers diagnosed with ADHD don't actually have it. They have the symptoms of it, but they don't have the neurological condition, yet they're being diagnosed and treated for that. So that's what got me going with the whole screen time and
Wow.
everything else of mental health, depression, anxiety, and so forth.
Wow, it's super interesting. So I was teaching up until 2008. My last year in the classroom was actually in 2006, because then 2006 to 2007, then 2007 to 2008, I had an administrative role, so I wasn't in the classroom anymore. But in 2007, 2006, 2007 is when everyone had a BlackBerry. And so I just was on that front cusp of seeing those changes in kids. 2009, I think, is when the iPhone came out. Uh, so, I was just like right at the front end of it, but I was noticing that kids had them all the time. They were taking pictures of their tests and texting them to friends, so like final exam, they'd have their phone down in their shirt and they'd be taking a picture of their test and sending it to another kid. And, they always have their phones kind of like tucked down. They were trying to hide them, tucked down in their shirt, but you could tell they had them. And so is it interesting? It's interesting. I would kind of love to, I became a stay-at-home mom, but I kind of would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to see that sort of progression of how that changed, because it was already starting to change so much in 2007. And then you say in 2008, uh, interesting timeline that you had the very first instance of this teen that was diagnosed late. So you talk about it can take a lot for brain to change its wiring, typically 3 or more hours per day of consistent stimulating activity. And so I thought that was interesting because teens are on screens for way more than 3 hours a day. You say the most up to date findings is the average American teen spends 9 hours per day or 63 hours per week immersed in electronic media, not including school related technology. So, is this 9 hours a day plus school related technology? Is this changing the brain?
100%. So depending on the research you look at, so the 9 hours a day includes multitasking, so it's really more like somewhere between 7 and 8 hours a day. And that's 7 days a week. In fact, it's more, kids spend more time, more of their life on screens than they do other life activity, including sleep. So what happens is this. So what you're referencing in the book is something known as neuroplasticity. So the term, and that's actually the greatest breakthrough in modern day psychology, which shows that the brain, like plastic, can be molded. So any human brain that is engaged in anything that's considered highly stimulating for 3 hours or more per day, the brain will literally grow new neural pathways. Those are those little tree branch looking electrical impulses to assimilate and adapt to that environment. And we know that kids are spending not 3 hours a day, 7 or 8 hours a day in the most highly stimulating world. So their brains have changed and adapted to this, to this really intense, highly stimulating cyber world. And as a result, it's sort of unadapting, to the real world. So the ability to sit in the classroom and focus and listen to a teacher becomes very difficult because that brain is constantly looking for stimulation. So now you have a kid that has all, the inattentiveness, lack of focus, and is now diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. So that's
Right.
research.
Required through that 3 hours or more. It's really hard to even imagine. We see these statistics, they've been out for a while, of the 6 to 7 hours a day, doesn't include schoolwork. It's hard to even wrap your head around. I
Oh, yeah.
think, what kids are on screens late into the night. I mean, how does that even look, in terms of a day? What's interesting to me too is this timepiece is also coming up for nature play. So, 3 hours a day is actually a baseline recommendation for nature play. All and more as kids when kids are younger. So I think something like 5 to 8 hours when they're toddlers and preschoolers, but all the way through adolescence. I'm seeing things like 3 to 4 hours a day of outdoor play if kids can get it, or just free play. Ideally outdoors, but at least just sort of this free time and free play. And so that's really getting sucked up by screens.
Oh yeah, and that's why I love your movement. The 1,000 hour outside movement. I think it's just that alone. Being outside, being part of nature. That's what we are. Is just critically, important for the entire development of children, physically, mentally, emotionally, the whole family. And we have, the majority of kids in our country that are like really hunkered up in their bedrooms, isolated by themselves. Flipping around on TikTok and going on YouTube and just, immersed in this like superficiality, and they're missing reality.
Yeah, and I think part of it is just bringing back a balance. For our family, our oldest just turned 13, and if we're outside for 3 to 4 hours a day, there just isn't the time for screens. And so, my kids, they love screens. They want to play all the things, they want to play the video games. They want to, they're not on social media, but they want to play online with their friends. And some of that's fun for them. They've got friends that, have moved to different states. And so that's a cool way for them to connect. But, there's just not, we're trying to make it so there's not that much time for it. Maybe there's an hour, maybe there's 45 minutes, maybe there's no time for it that day. And those are our best days. So that's my goal as a mom.
Oh yeah, yeah. In
I,
fact,
because then you don't have the fights. If you don't have the time, you don't have the time, right?
it's interesting, real quick, bouncing off that. So up here, I live in northern New Jersey, so a lot of kids. I'm not sure what it's like. I'm probably similar around the country. A lot of kids go to sleepaway camp for the summer for 7 weeks
Okay.
in this area, and
I've actually not heard of that.
yeah, yeah. My kids didn't, but a lot of kids up in this area they go literally go to sleepaway camp for 7 weeks, and there's no screens allowed. And what's interesting is when kids come back from the summer, kids that I see at my private practice, many of them I've asked, what was the best part of sleepaway camp, and they tell me not having their phone. So they actually don't. They actually crave that human connection and that social interaction, but they don't even know it until they're kind of forced to do it. And then when they resume back, from camp and so forth, they reflect back, and that is exactly what they inherently wanted.
Yeah, I think that those types of stories are popping up a lot. We've been doing a little bit with this Gab wireless company. So they have non-smartphones. That's their whole gig, and
Yeah,
it looks like a
I've done some
smartphone.
work with that.
Yeah, they're a cool company. It looks like a smartphone, so kids don't get made fun of. But they're saying the stories that the kids are mad initially, but within a couple weeks they just come back and say thank you, because it's opening a whole new world for them. They don't. I mean, they don't really know different, right? They've been immersed in technology since they were born, and so this is part of their world, and they may not have experience of not being connected and those types of
Yeah,
things.
we
Young.
call them digital natives, kids born into
Okay.
it. And then
Yeah.
somebody like I'm a digital immigrant, so I have the experience prior to screens, but kids don't. This is what they know. You only know what you know.
You only know what yeah, when television is on all the time, when you can always watch a program, when there's always YouTube videos. For us in the 80s, right, it was different. It was, there was only shows on Saturday morning till 11 and then they were over. And, there was nothing on TV on Sundays. I remember that, except for like WWF
Yeah,
wrestling. That was it. That was all that was on. And
they were
so,
good. They were
you
good,
know,
wholesome shows too, like
I
Living Up
remember
to
thinking, I
Their.
remember thinking as a kid on Sundays, I remember thinking, I wish I liked this. But I didn't. And so I didn't like it. I didn't like the WWF. And so you got to go find something else to do. But, kids who are born, teenagers today are born in 2007, 2008. This, like you said, this is all they've known. One of the things you said in your book I found was interesting. You just had this part of a sentence. You say, few took the necessary steps to change their children's media habits or their own. And so, I think this topic of media and social media and screens and being connected, I think that this is a pervasive topic. Parents are hearing about this often,
Mhm.
but I would agree with you that few are making the necessary steps to change. We're just kind of going along with it. As a whole, why do you think we're not taking those necessary steps?
Well, the reason is that adults are just as addicted as the kids are to the screens. In fact, if you look at the research, adults are spending just as much time on their own devices and screens than kids are. So, for a parent that sees that there's a problem with their own teenager or whatever, they need to kind of practice what they preach. So it really starts with us adults and being the example of the kid, for the kids, which means, when we're home with our children, doing the best we can to put down our own, computer screens, our own devices, and so forth, and just, having, deep, meaningful, communication and experiences with our children. So that's really the reason.
Yeah, that's good. You talked about, I'd not heard of this. Okay, this was really interesting to me, and I wanted to look them up. I didn't have a chance to, but the Wyndham Hotel chain discovered that the average resort guest was bringing 3 devices to the pool and checking them 80 times a day. So they began to offer a pouch to lock their devices in and including perks. I love this. This is actually really brilliant for this hotel chain. And they would include perks for locking up your phone, basically, like
Mhm.
free snacks or prime spots around the pool. I love that. A 5% discount on their stay if they put their phones in a time lock box. And you say a growing number of hotel chains are doing the same thing, where they're offering perks like free snorkeling or board games to guests who go phone free, because their mission is to promote wellness and relaxation, and screens are getting in the way of this mission. Where did you come across all that information? It's
Just,
super.
just the research, and it's kind of, it's interesting, but it's also sad. Like we can't even go on a nice to a nice resort on a vacation and enjoy the beautiful blue ocean and the perfect temperatures and the pool in front of us because we're distracting ourselves. We travel quite a bit, my wife and my kids, been all over the place, and I notice it when if we're at a resort, there's not too many kids near the pool. I think a lot of them are kind of cooped up in a hotel room. There are kids, but not as many as there should be, at a family resort. And I've seen that. Unfortunately, I think a lot of kids would, not all of them, but many would rather just be inside the hotel room, on their screen.
Well, maybe they don't know any different. I mean, that's interesting that you bring that up, because that's exactly why I started writing about our outside experiences, was because when my kids were young, I just fell into this. A friend told me, that there was this educational, uh, this philosopher, I guess, she's from the 1800s, turns out, but she talked about kids being outside for 4 to 6 hours a day whenever the weather is tolerable. And I'd actually never heard anything like that before. I thought it was an absurd idea, but we started to do it. We tried it out, and it sort of blew my mind, because my really little kids, who couldn't concentrate on anything, any project, any craft I set out for them, for more than 10 or 15 minutes, they could be completely occupied in nature for these long spans of time. And so that helped me as a mom. It was just for myself. I got a breather. But so for 2 years, we were spending this 4 to 6 hours of time outside, and we're in the Metro Detroit area. It's really populated, lots of parks, and we never ran into another kid the whole time. We're outside. Not every single day, but several days a week, we were trying to get these large chunks of time, and we were not running into other kids. But what I learned is this makes my parenting easier. In the long run, my kids are better able to occupy themselves. They're more creative. And so um, I think maybe it's parents don't even know, the kids don't know. Hey, if we went and sat around the pool, they're not going to bug you. They're not going to be in your hair. They're going to be finding things to do, especially the more that you do it, right?
100%. Yeah, I read your website and I saw that. It's exactly right. You go to a playground or park and it's like empty. It's like, what's going on here? Where,
Yeah.
where are all the
Yeah,
kids?
even I guess you said the resorts. I looked you talked about in the book, I think, or maybe I found it through the Wyndham Hotel, this company called Yonder.
Yeah.
And they make these phone cases that lock, and so I'm like, "Oh, I'll try and buy one. This seems neat." Or we try and do giveaways a lot with our podcast. So I thought, "Oh, this would be a cool thing," but you can't even buy it. It's like as a whole, you have to get the whole system for your organization, or for your school. They say we create phone-free spaces for artists, educators, organizations, and individuals. But like, you're buying this system to put in your building or whatever, where
Yeah.
people come and unlock their phone. It's quite an eye-opening product, right? When you
Yeah,
what's
Yonder
going
case. Yeah.
on.
And it
Oh,
really, it's a pretty cool idea, but when you really kind of think deeply about it, it just proves that we don't have control over these things anymore. They have control over us, where we have to actually lock it in a case because we can't
right,
prevent ourselves from the
right.
temptation of the
I mean,
phone.
this
I mean,
is
that's
a
crazy.
whole business.
Crazy.
Yeah, it is. And then I guess to your point, like we talked about earlier, which is, if it's a problem for us as adults, how much more is it a problem for kids? And that, just should they have these Yonder things in schools? I mean, how hard is it for a kid to sit and listen to a lecture,
Yeah.
when they've
Some
got
schools
their.
do have them. Some schools have gotten the Yonder
That's
cases.
great.
Yeah.
That's great. You talk about the risks. Although smartphones appear to make our children fit in, I believe the risks are too great. Let's talk about. I know we've talked a little bit about them, but what are some of the main risks of smartphones for kids?
So remember how I had mentioned earlier that in September of 2008, When I was working at the high school, we had our first kid with attention deficit disorder come in. Right around 2012, all of that changed. And literally 90 something percent of all the referrals to that committee were now for kids with anxiety disorders. Okay. So
Okay.
the original version of the book, which came out in 2016, I make a strong case as to how the smartphones and modern day technology are creating, this epidemic of anxiety. Since then, all of the research that the researchers have done comes out to support everything that I talk about. And why is that? Well, it kind of starts like this. In a kid right now, the average age for first smartphone issuance is like 10 years old. Okay, so as soon as a kid gets the smartphone, here's how the anxiety is a huge component of this, because they get their smartphone, and we want to believe that our kids are going to be okay, and then before long they're totally immersed in it, and they're falling behind in school. It's causing conflict inside the household, and it progresses where when I talk to teenagers, I've asked hundreds of teenagers the following question: what time do you go to sleep at night during the school week? In the privacy of my office. This was when I was at the high school. And just about every one of them told me that they go to sleep between 1 and 4 a.m. on school nights, and that their parents don't know it because their phones are upstairs in their bedrooms with them. So they're not getting enough sleep. So that perpetuates anxiety. And then it's this sort of look at me. Like, so now when you have social media and you have a vulnerable adolescent, and just by the very definition of adolescents are insecure. They're trying to figure out where they fit in and who they are and so forth. And now they have, and I talk about this in the book, a front row movie ticket to the screen of everybody else's perfect, wonderful, self-glorified life. And they're just bombarding their minds with all of these images and stuff of their peers. And it's actually stripping their self-esteem away from them, causing the anxieties, the depressions, and everything else that we're seeing.
Yeah. I mean, I think back on my own childhood school experiences, and I mean, I enjoyed most of school, but then I do remember certain times where, in middle school, let's say, where it was always like girl things, like it's two girls pitted against one, and I remember having these time periods where I'm like, oh, I really don't want to go back. It's like you'd have a break, and I'd be like, oh, it's so much drama, but at least you had this time period where you could leave it. You got home at 3 o'clock and you could leave it until the next day, or you had a weekend, or you had a school break. Um, but kids can't leave it if they have the smartphone, right?
Yeah, and it recruits other kids, to join in on the ganging up, basically, and it doesn't go away.
Yeah. One of the things you talked about in here is lack of resilience. Students are afraid to fail. They do not take risks and need to be certain about things. For many, failure is seen as catastrophic and unacceptable. Do you think that lack of resiliency is coming from smartphone use?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. I think one of the issues is that if you look at kids today, you don't see too many kids walking, to school, or you see what I see by where I live, and I refer to this in the book, is parents in my town up here, every street is actually a dead end, so you don't have all that far to walk. So if you take the bus, it might be a 3-minute walk. But what I've seen, and again, a lot of the stuff I do is based with my own eyes that I see
Right.
in the real world. And I would see all the SUV with the mom and the teenagers, in the passenger seat, or younger kids waiting for the bus. So it kind of perpetuates this sort of fear mentality where parents are actually afraid of letting their kids walk to school because they think there's, a kidnapper, even though kidnapping is at an all-time historic low. And the reason for this fear is because we're bombarded all day long. It's just funnels right down through social media now, the news and everything. And it's just, how scary and frightening and terrible the world is, one thing after the next. That's what sells. And that creates this sort of protective nature, among parents. And as a result, we kind of like are bailing our kids out of everything, afraid of letting them fail, and afraid of, letting them even just go out and, walk to school on their own. So it certainly does affect their resilience, no question about it.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting that you brought up the walking to school, because that's actually this is only I think maybe my seventh or eighth session this season that we've recorded on a podcast. But walking to school or being outdoors has gotten brought up a couple different times. One, in sort of the realm of resiliency. Like, there was this mom who was saying, when I have my kids go outside in weather that's not ideal, which I think is a lot of times in the morning, especially depending on where you live. I remember we walked to school too. It was a mile, and we're in Michigan, so I mean, it was cold. My parents did not drive us. Everyone walked. They would walk with us sometimes, depending on how old we were. But we walked, and so this mom was saying that when her kids are outside in this uncomfortable weather, that is helping them to develop resilience. And then we had a doctor on talking about sleep, and he said one of the best things that you can do for your sleep is to walk to school because you wake up and you go outside, so you're exposed to the bright sun, even if it's still kind of early, even if it's a cloudy day, and then you're warming up your body through that movement, and that sort of sets your curve for the day, is what he was talking about. Um, so I think it's sort of like what the whole theme is, that we're trying to do the best for our kids, but inadvertently
Mhm.
we're misguided.
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick story
Yeah.
while we're on the topic. So I remember when I was walking to school as a kid, like kindergarten, first, second grade, I'd walk down my street, there'd be a crossing guard, and then you'd make a left, and there was a railroad crossing. It was a freight train, and my mom was actually the crossing guard, right? Because they had to be a crossing guard at the railroad crossing. So every so often, the train would get stuck, right? So you couldn't pass it. And what they would do is a police officer would arrive on the other side of the train, and then the crossing guard, in this case, my mother, would put each kid in between the train cars one at a time, right? And you'd feel the train nudge every now and then, like trying to go, but
Yeah,
there was no danger whatsoever. But if that
right.
happened, if that were to happen now, and somebody took a video of it, the town would be sued, the police officer would be sued, the crossing guard would be sued, it would be all over the news, And again, that's another, fear, sort of a fear mongering thing. I mean, it sounds crazy, but there was no danger.
It was probably kind of fun. I mean, I bet it added a
I loved it.
little bit of, I don't know, some
They have
extra
little ladders, like you go
day.
up and help you, and you go like between cars, then the cops
Sure.
on the other side.
I mean,
Yeah,
I would imagine as a kid, you would absolutely love that. Kids love trains. You get to kind of
yeah.
climb
It's
over
not like
it.
it's not like the train. If you ever see a train, it goes do do do. Before it gets to
Yeah, right.
50 minute before it gets to 2 miles per hour. So it's not like a Tesla where the thing's just gonna go and the kid's
Right,
gonna
right.
stuck
Yeah.
on the train car.
I've been in a Tesla once, and you are
Yeah.
right. I was like, I feel a little motion sick in this thing. Okay, all right. Here's a really interesting tidbit that I got out of your book. And actually, I think this is probably one of the things that I'll think back on a whole lot. You talk about multitasking. So, this is the day and age of multitasking. And you said multitasking can cause fragmented thinking, IQ score declines, similar to if the subject had smoked marijuana or stayed up all night. You said IQ drops of 15 points for multitasking adults lowered their scores to the average range of an 8-year-old. And so here's you said, the next time you're writing your boss an email during a meeting, remember that your cognitive capacity is being diminished to the point that you might as well let an 8-year-old write it for you. I thought that is something to kind of tuck in. We're trying to multitask, but we're really diminishing our capacity. Um, so how does multitasking affect our IQ and our performance?
So it's interesting about multitasking, which is task switching. It's moving from one platform to the next. So if somebody's like watching TV, they're on their computer, they're looking at their phone, and you take kids listening to music, trying to do homework, checking their phone, going back and forth, the television's on. That's called multitasking. And what people don't realize is that the brain can only do one thing at a time. So some of the research I came across, which is very compelling, is that the higher the level of multitasker, in every case, if you ask somebody that does a lot of multitasking, they'll tell you that they're really good at it. And all the research shows that the higher the level of the multitasker, the more lousy you actually are at multitasking. So it's pretty interesting, but there's also some changes. There was one researcher I referenced in the book by the name of Clifford Nass out of Stanford, who did some experiments with students, high multitaskers and low multitaskers, and had them do this little experiment to see what was happening in their brain. And he had, one group of high multitaskers and the other group didn't really do much multitasking. And the high multitaskers, when hooked up to a functional MRI device, you could see the image of their brains, and they were using 20 times more brain power than a low multitasker. But it was it was the wrong part of the brain. Like during that experiment, you're supposed to be using your
Right.
executive functions, and the visual cortex of their brains was the part that was lighting up. So you can't sit in a classroom and the visual cortex part of your brain cannot listen to a teacher. That's what your executive functions do. So it actually changes the actual chemistry of the brain as well.
Wow. Wow, I mean, that's something to remember, right? That you're trying to multitask and it's taking you down to the level of an 8-year-old. I'm
Yeah.
definitely going to remember that. And it makes me think of kids in school. The kids in school when we were trying to do these different things and they've got their phones out, even way back when that's really affecting them. You say if parents could simply delay the age they give their children smartphones and allow them to use social media, we would see different statistics. Many parents I meet around the country tell me the biggest mistake they made was getting their child a smartphone. And this is a big statement. I've never had one parent come up to me after a lecture or email to tell me getting their child a smartphone was the smartest or best thing they ever did. It's usually the opposite, right?
100%. Yeah. I mean, before COVID, I was all over the country lecturing, and parent, they come up to you afterwards and the regrets of, they just, if parents want to think, I talk about social conformity in the book. Really, it's my favorite part actually of the whole book. Is how we as human beings, we just do what others do, kind of like the flock of birds.
Well, that's what I think about the SUV. I mean, I think that all the other moms are driving their SUVs to the bus stop. So then you think, well, otherwise I'm going to be the only one that
Well,
does it.
yeah, that's exactly right. Like the SUV is the most unpractical vehicle there is. It's a gas guzzler. You know what I mean? It's expensive, and you don't really, unless you have an army of kids. But no, you're right. Like this whole SUV, or you hear like, when you see the advertisements for SUVs, it's like, the Toyota Highlander going through the mountains, and who does that? No, we're driving on roads.
They're
And
just
in Michigan
driving
and
the kids
Jersey,
up the road to the bus
yeah,
stop.
when it snows out, they plow.
Yeah.
And you're not going out when it snows. But you're exactly right. It's another perfect example of conformity.
Yeah, which is just that in that what you were talking about, which is that no one's walking to the end of the street to the bus. All the parents are driving their kids. So then you don't want to be the only one that doesn't
That too. Yep.
drive your kids. And so what would you say the average age of a first smartphone is 10.3. Keep your children away from social media until late adolescence. They are not physiologically or emotionally ready to handle it. What would delaying do for our society, for kids?
Well, ideally, would be late adolescence. Late adolescence. Now, my son, who's a freshman in college, he was, and my daughter as well. They were the last kids to get phones, right? So my son didn't get a smartphone until after he graduated the 8th grade. He was 14 years old, and it was my old phone. There was no social media. It was just really a means for him to be able to text and stuff. So he didn't start. He was 18 years old. He didn't start using Snapchat until he was like almost 17. And he's at that age. He can handle that. When you're 12 and 13, you can't handle that because you're in a very critical stage of development. Where you're comparing yourself and so forth. So ideally is late adolescence. So and one question, people always ask me at the lectures is, well, what is the right age to get my child a smartphone? And the answer that I give, that I stole from somewhere, and I've referenced in the book, is as follows: when you feel comfortable with your child watching pornography.
Yeah, I've heard that before, and I read it in your book. Oh, it's a big statement.
No, it is. I mean, it's really just more to get an eye opener, because that's what happens when our kids get the phones at a young age. They're exposed to things that no parent would want them to be exposed to, and we can't really avoid it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point. So you talk about the dangers of smartphone use, talk about resiliency and neural wiring and pathways, and then there's this very real danger of pornography and
Oh yeah.
just other people that are grooming kids and
Hmm.
yeah, there's a lot of bullying, there's a lot there. So to just delay or like there are these companies like that Gab Wireless that are coming out with non-smartphones and what an awesome answer to a problem. You want to be able to maybe connect with your kid. They're at sports after school or things like that. And here's a safe way.
Yeah, it looks just. I have one over here. They sent me one.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it looks
it's great.
look, looks just like a smartphone. And
Yeah,
kid that's in 5th, 6th, 7th grade that's begging their parents, they could feel like they fit in, because you can't. The other kids won't be able to tell. They're not going to be caught with a flip phone. That's never going to happen.
right.
But the Gab, all you can do is you don't have any internet access. You could text, you can take some pictures and stuff, but you're not in going to be involved in the dangers that come with the smartphone.
Yeah, it's a product that was needed. That's for sure. Um, So this has just been a fabulous book, and I do love how you had it. It came up a couple times in there. How you said your daughter kept asking for a phone, and you just
Mhm.
kept saying no. And I think it's important for parents to know that there are other people saying no, that everyone else is also getting bugged all the time, but that you can say no. And like you said, waited until they were into high school,
Yeah.
at the end of high school before they're getting social media accounts.
Yeah,
Um,
it's tough because it is, it is their way of communicating, kids, but we can start with the gab, they can text message their friends, you know what I mean? And really, if we feel that they're old enough and responsible enough, which none of them really are, but it's up to us to be on top of their phone and realize actually it's not even their phone, it's mine. I'm just holding it.
Right, right. Who's paying for it? Well, even in the Gap, they talk about, we had them on the podcast this season, and they were talking about how in every other aspect of life, we teach things progressively, right? Kids start on a tricycle or they start on a no pedal bike. We have this progression of, how do they cook and when do they get to use the stove and all of these things. But with technology, we're just handing them the final product right
Mhm.
off the get go. And so,
Mhm.
why not also look at this as let's teach them good technology habits, teach them that we put the phone away at dinner.
And on the other end of it too, is the big tech industry, which I talk about in the book, and I'm doing more research and writing about. Is they design their products and they use these algorithms and everything else so that they are addictive, and they know that they're doing that. I mean, there was something that just came out. I don't know if you saw it. I did a radio interview last week where Facebook, who owns Instagram, um, there was an investigative journalistic piece that showed that Facebook did their own internal research on the impact of Instagram on young teenage girls, and it showed that teenage girls are more depressed, suffer from more anxiety, and are more likely to be suicidal because of Instagram. And they withheld that information from the general public until an investigative journalist came out and revealed it. And now they're kind of getting they're in a little bit of hot water right now.
Yeah, those are huge things. That's a really big deal. And like you said, you saw it starting in 2012 with the anxiety disorders, and that there's only certain people who would be on the front line there seeing the differences. For everyone else, it's like, well, we just have our kids. You don't really know what to compare it to. Um, but really neat that you had that firsthand experience of seeing this is how it always was, and then all of a sudden there's a change.
Oh yeah.
And you can trace that timeline back to phone usage. So, well, I really, really enjoyed your book, Tom. I'm gonna hold it up here again. This is Disconnected: How to Protect Your Kids from the Harmful Effects of Device Dependency. Tom, you have another book coming out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I'm in the middle of writing it, and I have no idea what it's about yet. That's how writing goes. No, I
Yeah,
kind of have an
yeah,
idea. You have to put together a whole outline and chapter ideas, and then you just kind of write and put things together. So it's really going to be about. That's not coming out until February of 2023. So it's like a year and a half away.
yeah,
But it's really going to focus specifically on all the hot bucket items that we're seeing, with our children nowadays, between the mental health, childhood obesity, which has skyrocketed since COVID. It's always been a problem, and just social and emotional skills and all that. So I'm really going to really kind of dive deep into what our children are nowadays, and how we can help them.
yeah. That's
So
great. So, if people want to know more about you, if they want to um, know more about when this book is coming out, where can people find you and information about you and your books?
yeah, so my website, it's tomkersting.com, just www.tomkersting.com. And I have some, so I don't really use social media, I'll be honest with you. Facebook, I actually use Facebook is more of my psychological laboratory where I actually look to see what's going on. But, you'll find me on TV. I do a lot of TV segments for Today's Show, different, Fox, more about parenting. I talk about, parenting and mental health and all that stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
people have probably seen you before, I'm sure.
yeah, yeah, and then the book you can get anywhere, anywhere books are sold. The current book.
Yeah, that's awesome. Hey, can we end with this, Tom? What's a favorite childhood memory of yours that was outside?
Right, comes right to my mind. Every Thanksgiving morning, my dad would take us, all of us, hiking. Right, he was a police officer, and the town right next to us called Rockley, New Jersey. There's a little sub police station. It was just woods that went on forever, and we would go hiking, and we called the Rockley Woods, and it was just we look forward to that so much. And I'll share something else with you. About 5 years ago, we took our own kids on that trail, my brother and my sisters and I, and my dad, and we totally forgot we found a tree that we all carved our names in. It said the Kerstings Thanksgiving 1980 with our initials. We found that tree.
Wow.
Yep.
I love that story because how simple is that? How
Uh,
simple is that?
that
That
might,
little Thanksgiving tradition of hiking. I mean, that is really simple, but it's amazing how impactful that was for you and how much you remembered it and how neat to come full circle and take your own kids.
yeah, it was really, really cool. I mean, we forgot about the tree, and all of a sudden we're walking on the trail and we see a big beech tree with our, the Kerstings, and when you carve something in a tree years later, it gets like wider because the tree grows. But 1980, Thanksgiving 1980. I'm like, oh my God, I'm that old.
I could carve my initials in 1980. That's great. But look how long that those memories stick. I think that's an encouragement to parents to know that simple things can leave a lasting impact. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to leave these lasting impacts with our kids and
That's it.
simple memories do it. So, well, thank you, Tom, so much for your time. Disconnected, you can get it anywhere books are sold. And keep a lookout because Tom's got another book coming out in a year and a half. So
All
thank you
right.
so much, Tom. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.